Hey guys, welcome back to Tabletop Glory. My name is Graham Johnson, and today I have a really interesting video. A friend of mine was watching one of my live streams recently where I was giving good advice to new miniature painters. One of the biggest pieces of advice that I always give on a live stream is that when you are painting a miniature, if you think you have made a mistake or you don't like where a paint scheme is going, to see it through to the end before deciding whether or not you want to strip it down and start over. The reason for this is learning to go around your mistakes or learning to work with your mistakes and make them seem a part of your paint scheme is one of the biggest tools in your arsenal that you can ever have. And teaching yourself to do that early on is one of the best ways that you're going to make the most progress when you first start miniature painting. So, without further ado, the challenge was to go and do exactly that. However, with the caveat that if I make a mistake, meaning that I accidentally paint something a wrong color by bleeding over into a new area, I either have to continue that paint scheme across that new area or cover it up in a way that you can't tell that the mistake was ever made. So an example of this would be if I were to paint down the chest plate with a specific color and accidentally blend it onto the pants, those pants either now need to be that color or a dark enough color to cover it up. So let's see how I did. So I approached today's project from the standpoint of a new miniature painter, someone who has a general concept of dry brushing and highlighting, and someone who is looking to save time. So we're going to take advantage of contrast paints. One of the things that I'm doing that most people probably wouldn't be taking advantage of is the fact that you can put on very thin layers of contrast paints to build up the darkness of colors. So if you really wanted your leading edges on that armor to be nice and thin, and you wanted a much darker color to be closer to the gaps in the armor, you could layer up your paint and get a much darker green closer to the gaps and have that much brighter green closer to your highlights. Now, one of the things to keep in mind though is that blending other colors into contrast paints, unless you have a solid understanding of your paints, their thickness, and how they work, blending colors into contrast paints, especially once they're dry, can be rather difficult for a new miniature painter. So you'll notice that in a lot of the places where I'm using contrast paints, outside of using something like dry brushing, I'm not really going back in and messing with them for that exact reason. Now, if you guys would like a video talking a bit more about how to blend in other colors with products like contrast paints or inks, I'm more than happy to make a video talking about that. But one of the issues with a video like that is it's a bit more on the edge of color theory, and I don't really want to talk your ear off. So we're going to save you all that pain and trouble, and we're only going to make that video if that's something that you guys want. Now, I end up using a product called Skeleton Horde here. Now that is contrast paint by Citadel, and although I kind of like how it turned out, I also kind of don't. Skeleton Horde is one of those colors that I both like and don't like. I feel it works really well when using it as a filter on top of other colors, that is to change the current value of a color into a different one. So putting it on top of something like Talaran Sand or Screaming Skull, I think it works really well, but using it in its traditional sense, like a traditional contrast paints, it just doesn't seem to work. You end up using so many layers of the stuff that by the time you're done, you should have just used a product like Talaran Sand or even a generic khaki paint. Now, I had taken today's paint scheme as inspiration from an image I had found on Pinterest. Unfortunately, I cannot share it with you guys as it is a copyrighted image. However, there was a lot of greens. Even in what was depicted as gold, there was still quite a bit of green. And I felt that was the artist attempting to show that this environment was very green and very alive, and maybe not necessarily that the gold had some green to it. But I really loved the green gold look, and I know that this Vallejo gold tends to have a very green tint to it, so I wanted to use it, and then I wanted to highlight with a traditional gold color, which I end up doing down the road much later on. I actually almost forgot to do the highlights on the gold, if I'm being completely honest. However, I do actually really like using this product for doing golds on anything that is kind of wood elf or nature themed. I just don't use it that often because it is quite green. Something that's really important to keep to mind is that if you're going to be painting a model that doesn't have a lot of contrast, and especially if you're going to be painting a model like this where there is a lot of similar colors, in the case here we're now using 3 different kinds of brown, it's important to try and make sure that you're using browns that are relatively distinctly different. And I say that because I know I'm kind of breaking my own rule here with using 3 different browns that are vaguely similar to one another. And even more so once everything's all said and done. I end up doing some highlights that I then cover up with more contrast paints, and although it looks a lot better, it ends up getting to a point where all 3 browns kind of look very similar to one another. It's another good reason why having contrast is such an important thing. And if I were going to change anything about this, I would go back in and I would add a lot of contrast to the bow and the arrows by using something like a Talaran sand or an Nashapti bone. Something that's going to pick that apart and make it much brighter and make it distinct and make it feel like it's different from all the leathers. And here was where I made a big mistake. I decided to start adding in some contrast by adding in some rough dry brush highlights, and I go way too bright, way too quick, and it just looks bad. It stops looking like leather, and then I attempt to fix that by putting a thin coat of contrast paints on top of it, and it kind of brings us right back to where we start while darkening up the recesses just a little bit, and it's not good. It's good enough by the time we get to the end and it kind of all works out in the wash, but honestly this is one of those cases where I should have left well enough alone. So it was at this point I wanted to start putting some color into the skin, and I decided to go with Druchii Violet. Now if you're following along at home, pretty much any purple wash would work here. Don't forget to grab the ears if your model's ears are hanging out of their hair. That's something that I oftentimes tend to forget, and I kind of do all of the skin and get all the highlights good, and then all of a sudden notice I missed an ear. It seems like it happens to me almost every single time I paint. And here you can see me kind of going back in and picking out some places with an XV88 overcoat. These are places where I just wanted to add a pop of color, and I wanted it to stay in the brown persuasion, which is why you can see me pretty much affixing to just the bow as well as around the belt region, which I end up using a much brighter highlight down the road of Screaming Skull, but I forgot to record that. I apologize. Moving right along with some Seraphim Sepia, I started doing this as a pre-shade for doing a blonde hair scheme, but I decided with the purple skin I wanted to go with blue hair. I wanted things to feel kinda samey while also feeling different. For some reason, purple skin and blue hair just is a combo that works for me when it comes to elves, and I end up doing that with some Drakenhof Nightshade. Now my Drakenhof Nightshade is starting to expire, so it does tend to dry quite a bit darker, and it can also work really nicely with Drakenhof Nightshade and really dark gray to do the illusion of a almost oily black hair. So if you're kind of wanting a really dark, almost black color, but you don't want to paint with pure black, I really recommend mixing up a very dark gray and doing several coats of Drakenhof Nightshade. It looks really wonderful. Now, I was originally going to end the video there, but a lot of you guys have been asking me to show more basing on screen. It seems that my way of basing is something that you guys really, really enjoy. However, one of the things that I will not be doing, because I'm trying to keep this in the tradition of a new painter, I'm not going to be adding tufts of grass or static grass or anything like that. It will get some for my final version that is going in my personal collection, but for today's video, in the spirit of a new miniature painter, we're going to be sticking with products that are relatively easily available. So in my case, we're going to be using some 1/8 inch cork. Now you can get this at like office supply places, or you can order it online. It's really, really cheap. We're just using some super glue to affix it in place, and then we're going to be using some basing paste to kind of finish the whole thing off. Now again, you could use some grass tufts and things like that to kind of finish things up and make it look really nice, but I wanted to kind of make this relatively friendly and on a budget, so that's what we're going to be doing for basing. But as you can see, it's pretty simple, it's pretty straightforward. I'm just layering up the cork and adding some height and kind of blending in that little faux rock that the model is attached to. I've seen a lot of people kind of replace that and mount this figure on a lot of different things, including like piles of books and things like that, and it works really nicely for stuff like that. It's really awesome that this dynamic pose works as well as it does in other things, but this is a really great way that you can blend that rock into the base. And last but not least, don't forget to go ahead and add some grays and whites to kind of blend that in with that rock face. That's really all we did here. We started with a nice dark gray, went to a medium gray, and then almost all the way up to a pure white with Ushabti bone, and we just used that to kind of blend everything all together. That's how you end up with that kind of faux rock finish, like what I painted him with originally, and now what I'm adding to the base to kind of blend it all in. And there you go, guys. I think we're going to call this challenge video done. I think we're going to call this the Practice What You Preach. I was really happy that my friend reached out to me with this great idea for this video. Now, is this the best work that I can do? No, but it is a good example of what I oftentimes tell miniature painters who are just getting into the hobby is my best advice that I could possibly give them. And that is to finish what you start before deciding whether or not you want to strip it down and start over. I know I learned a few things along the way, and if I learned a few things, even after 8 years of being in this hobby, I'm pretty sure that a person who is brand spanking new is going to learn a whole heck of a lot. In any case, thank you guys so much for all the love and support. It's been really awesome. And one thing I want to say is this model is actually a really great place to take to a further level. Like, this is a great starting point. I could see myself dumping a few more hours into this and really turning it into something special. And who knows, maybe that's a video for down the road, but for right now, I'm more than happy to put this model in my display case. In any case, thank you guys so much for sharing the video around and sharing my other videos around. I am so blown away by the growth that this channel has seen in the last few months. But unfortunately, we are out of time for today, so until next time, may your display case always be filled and your pile of shame never run empty.